What is philosophy? An overview of philosophical themes by Dr. Israelsen. The word philosophy, philosophia in Greek, is difficult to easily define. Broken down into its constituent parts, it literally translates to love of wisdom. Philo, love, right, as in the word philanthropist. And Sophia, meaning wisdom. So we have the love of wisdom. This etymological fact, i.e. fact about the nature of the word, indicates an important difference between philosophy and every other subject. First off, we have love, right? And this is meant to be taken literally, right? Here we have a picture of Psyche being revived by Cupid's kiss, right? Philosophy is erotic. Philosophy is wound up with an emotional affect, the emotional affect of love. It is defined by love of its object, which is wisdom, right? Here we have Socrates about to drink the hemlock that killed him after he's sentenced to death by the Athenian jurors. And Socrates is often, and rightly so, seen as sort of the face of wisdom in the Western tradition, right? So love of wisdom, right? This is what the word literally translates to. Now, it can be helpful to realize just how distinct this makes philosophy if we contrast it with any other given field, right? So take a distinct field. It doesn't really matter which one. I have three options here: biology, geology, psychology, right? Now, as you can immediately see, these words all share an etymological structure. They all start with a prefix and they end with logi, logos. So the prefix denotes a given domain of inquiry. In the case of biology, bios is the Greek for life, geo for earth, psyche for soul. The suffix logos, which means account, word, or explanation, is wedded to these individual prefixes. Thus, the words get their sense. Biology is thus the explanation or account of life. Geology, the explanation or account of earth. And psychology, the explanation of soul, right? Philosophy differs from any such field, right? And this difference is reflected in its etymology, in the structure of the word. Philosophy, unlike biology, unlike geology, psychology, or whatever else, right, has no particular domain, right? So take a biologist. Insofar as a biologist is acting as a biologist, their interests are fixed by the nature of their domain, the nature of the domain of life, right? A biologist has no interest, insofar as they're a biologist, in stones. A biologist is interested in things that live, and their explanatory structures, their methods, and their accounts conform to their domain, right? A biologist explains living things. A geologist explains stones, the nature of the earth. A psychologist explains souls, or spirit, or mind, or whatever, right? Philosophy doesn't have a particular domain like that, right? There is no there is no structure here of a prefix and then logos. Instead, we have an effective attitude, philo, love of wisdom, right? So philosophy is thus not primarily to be defined as an account or an explanation. Philosophy is instead defined by its dispositional attitude, that of love, right? A moment ago I said philosophy is erotic. I don't mean that in the sense of, pornographic or anything. What I mean by that is that philosophers are defined by desire, a desire to have wisdom, to understand, and to live in a good and full way, right? A way that is characterized by wisdom, right? So philosophy is thus not primarily concerned with knowledge, as biology, geology, psychology, whatever else, economics, right, history. These things are all concerned with knowledge, right? The possession of facts. Philosophy is, of course, concerned with knowledge in a certain sense, right? But more centrally and more importantly, it's concerned with wisdom. So what's the distinction between knowledge and wisdom? Well, we might define knowledge as the possession of facts about a given topic, right? To know something, to know X or Y is to have, facts about X or Y, right? Whereas wisdom we might define as the experiential understanding and moral capacity to use knowledge, right? Wisdom has much more to do with action. It has much more to do with living a good and rich life, right? Knowledge is powerful, right? But if you don't know how to apply it, don't know how to use it, right, then it doesn't do one much good, right? So we might wonder here, which is more important, knowledge or wisdom? Now, of course, there's no reason to think that both aren't important. Obviously, both are important. But I think it's worth asking, if we could only have one, right, which would we rather have? Well, let's try to think, what would knowledge without wisdom look like? I have here a picture of Saruman, if you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings, the books or the films or both, right? Saruman is a powerful wizard, right? He's a powerful and very knowledgeable individual, but he has no wisdom, right? He doesn't have the capacity to use his knowledge for good purposes, and so he ends up, allying himself to Sauron and thus bringing about his own downfall, right? Knowledge without wisdom can be a dangerous thing. It doesn't do one much good if they have all the knowledge in the world but no moral capacity to use it in good ways. Contrast this with Samwise Gamgee, the humble hobbit, who is very wise, even though he doesn't know much about anything, right? He's not a knowledgeable man, knowledgeable hobbit, I suppose. He doesn't have a doctorate. He doesn't have much theoretical understanding of the nature of the world, but he's good and pure, right? And he's able to help save Middle-earth because of the purity of his wisdom, right? I think it's fairly clear that most of us would rather have wisdom than knowledge, right? Knowledge, a lack of knowledge can always be made up. You can always learn more. You can always read more books, take more classes. A lack of wisdom is much more difficult to make up, right? Because wisdom isn't learned through books. Wisdom isn't learned through theoretical understanding. Wisdom is gained through experience. Wisdom is gained through hard-won lessons, through aging and going through things and coming out the other side having learned something. So with that basic sort of background, we come to an important question. The question is, why study philosophy? What's the point, right? Why is philosophy something that's important to study? And I think that people often ask this question in light of the fact that there are two other disciplines, or sets of disciplines perhaps, that are similar to philosophy in method to an extent, and certainly in their aim. These two disciplines are religion and science, right? Now, discipline is probably not the right word here because these aren't unique or singular disciplines. They're more like overarching approaches to the nature of the world, right? But oftentimes these are the two approaches whereby people come to their conception of truth, whereby they interpret the world and attempt to explain the world, either through a religious tradition and structure or through a scientific framework, right? And religion and science are both obviously hugely important. Philosophy is not a replacement for these things, but philosophy can do something unique that neither religion nor science can do. However, a lot of people tend to view philosophy as being somehow superfluous or unnecessary because of one or the other of these traditions, right? If someone is heavily invested in their religious tradition, they might think that philosophy is just a bunch of confusion. It just makes things less clear rather than more clear. Conversely, if someone is very, very invested in the hard sciences, in physics and mathematics, they might think that philosophy is an older tradition that is no longer as useful as perhaps it once was, given the rise of science's sort of dominance. I think both of these are mistakes that people make. So I'm going to propose three main arguments for why it's important to study philosophy and why philosophy is unlike any other game in town, as it were. The first argument, well, I suppose perhaps there's four. The first argument is one I've already sort of alluded to in the preceding slides, which is that there's really no avoiding philosophy, right? Human beings are philosophical creatures by nature. We are all sort of born with curiosity, right? If you've ever spent time around young children, you know their favorite thing to ask is why, right? Why this? Why that? Children are insatiably curious and they want to know why and how things work, right? And that curiosity doesn't really go away as we age. Sometimes we forget about it for a time, but people are intrinsically curious. And so everybody has a natural philosophical disposition. They just never oftentimes trained it or really learned how to recognize it. But so three specific arguments now for the importance of studying philosophy. The first one here is that it's necessary to study philosophy to understand intellectual history, right? If you want to understand where we are, historically speaking, culturally speaking, socially, politically, etc., it's necessary to study the history of ideas, right? Politics, social structures, moral norms, these things don't arise in a vacuum. They don't come out of nowhere. They arise as a result of people thinking very long and hard about fundamental questions, right? And the history of thinking about, these fundamental questions is the history of philosophy, right? So philosophy is wound up with every aspect of human culture. The second argument I'm going to make is that for all of its success, science has certain limits, right? Science cannot answer every question that we might have about the nature of reality. And where science starts running into limitations is precisely where philosophy shows its strength. Finally, the third argument I'm going to give is that philosophy is necessary for us to do ethics, for us to talk meaningfully about morality, for us to figure out how to solve moral disputes. So in what follows, I'm going to be running through these three arguments. All right, so the first one here, understanding intellectual history. To understand the present, it is, unsurprisingly, necessary to understand the past, right? If we really want to have a grip on what's going on in the current world, you just can't do that without understanding the past. And, a lot of time is spent in history classes studying wars, studying the changing shape of continents, of political and geological boundaries, right, as nations rise and fall. But more centrally important than studying the history of warfare or empire is studying the history of ideas, right? I have here a famous painting of the French Revolution, right? While this revolution is noteworthy for any number of reasons, what's centrally important is not the blood spilt or the violence. What's centrally important is a change in mindset that led to a fundamental alteration in European consciousness, right? This was very much a philosophical revolution, and to understand its origins and what it changed, it's necessary to understand the philosophical ideas that led to it, right? Just one case in point. But everything is the same way. Everything is wound up with the intellectual self-conception that we have had as a race, as a human beings, as a human race, and as individual nations, cultures, so on and so forth. So in that sense, all particular disciplines and areas of human study are related to philosophy, and more specifically are offshoots of philosophy, right? Back in the day, all seekers of knowledge were simply called philosophers, right? So physics, psychology, anthropology, economics, whatever, these are all offshoots of philosophy. They are all particular ways in which we start seeking for wisdom and understanding in relation to this or that particular field, but all of them find their grounding and their root in the philosophical impetus. To such an extent that, someone like Galileo, one of the, founding figures of the scientific revolution, Galileo's title at the Italian court was court philosopher, right? There was no such thing as a scientist. That's a newer word. Philosopher is the word that goes all the way back through Western history, whereby anyone concerned with seeking knowledge and wisdom would have been identified. Right? As the love of wisdom, philosophy is simply the desire to understand reality. Hence, it shows up in all of these different fields. It is intellectual seeking at its most basic. Right. So if you care about ideas like having a good government, justice, the existence or non-existence and nature of God, right and wrong, human nature, the development of culture, if you care about these things, then you care about philosophy. All of these things are philosophical questions. And it should be immediately obvious, everyone cares about these things, right? There is no one for whom these questions are completely irrelevant if they're being honest with themselves. These questions are relevant to everyone. So philosophy is relevant to everyone. All right, the second argument, the limitations of science. Material science, by which I simply mean an attempt to explain the physical world, the material world, has obviously been hugely successful over the past 400 years, right? With the advent of the new science of people like Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, right? And its continual success, right? We've had unparalleled advances in technology and our capacity to understand and manipulate the physical world, right? Science is great. Science is very good at what it does. But this fact has led to a type of hubris or pride in science and what we might call scientism, the idea that science is the only thing necessary, and has led many people to believe that philosophy is no longer necessary at all, that philosophy is something like pre-science, that it's a crude first attempt to explain the world, and now that we've done that successfully via science, we can sort of kick away the ladder that we used to climb up to this point and dispense with philosophy. I think this is a very serious mistake. To see why it's a mistake, let's consider a pretty broad question here. Simply, what is science, right? Now, science is a word that gets kicked around all the time, right? It's nothing more common than hearing science appealed to. Scientists have said, science has shown us, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not really clear that people really know what they mean when they say that word, right? So what is science? Well, what we now call science is what used to be called natural philosophy. It is simply philosophy applied to the natural world, right? So Aristotle, for instance, arguably the very first scientist in this sense, he called it natural philosophy. It's the attempt to bring to bear first principles of explanation and understanding to the physical world and an attempt to understand it. So in this sense, science is a very old thing, a very old endeavor. But science in the particular form and shape that we talk about it now dates back around 400 years. This modern concept dates back to the 1600s and the advent of the new science developed by the figures I just mentioned, people like Copernicus, etc. Right? So if we had to define, again, science is difficult to define, especially because really there's no such thing as science as a singular pursuit, right? There are sciences, there's physics and chemistry and biology, right? But if we had to try to define science broadly as a family of views or a single tradition, we might do so as follows. Science is the attempt to understand the material world in mathematical terms according to a method of observation, theorization, and experimentation, right? Now, does this perfectly encapsulate everything science is and does? Well, no, probably not. I mean, how science is to be defined is a matter of quite a bit of debate within the philosophy of science, but I think this ticks most of the boxes. It's an attempt to understand the material world in mathematical terms according to a method of observation, theorization, and experimentation. Okay. So by definition then, science is a fairly narrow pursuit, right? It's the pursuit of physical knowledge. Science is only interested and only capable of explaining the physical world, right? Now, one might counter that there is only physical knowledge. That is, they might defend the position of metaphysical materialism, which states that all that exists is matter in motion, right? So when I say that science is a narrow pursuit because it's only concerned with physical knowledge, what I mean is it can't by definition be concerned with metaphysical things. Metaphysics is the study of things beyond the physical. Meta means above or beyond. Physics means nature, right? Physis in Greek, I'm sorry. So metaphysical knowledge would be knowledge about things like the soul or God or an afterlife, right? Things above and beyond the physical world. So one might very well counter that such things don't exist, right? There is no soul. That's an old fairy tale. There is no God. There is no afterlife, someone might be inclined to say. Well, okay, maybe, but that claim, right, the claim that there is no such thing as a soul or God is in and of itself not a scientific claim, right? What I mean by that is it's not scientific, it's a metaphysical claim. It's a type of philosophical claim. How could we possibly know that there was no God, right? How could we know that there was no such thing as a soul? Well, to see why, consider what science is. Science is the mathematical description of material things and events, right? In order to work, science must presuppose the material or physical world as its sole domain, right? God is not an object for scientific investigation, right? Neither is the soul. From the fact, however, that science can only describe physical things, in no way shows that there are only physical or material things, right? It doesn't show that. If there are some things that are beyond the physical realm, or outside of it, or different in kind from it, things such as God, the soul, an afterlife, or free will, i.e. metaphysical things, then science by definition could not discuss them, right? So the strength of science is precisely to be found in the fact that it's narrowly defined. It's a narrow field of investigation, the pursuit of physical knowledge. But from the fact that it pursues physical knowledge exclusively, we can't conclude that thereby that there is only physical knowledge. To do that is to take a step outside of science into metaphysics and to make a metaphysical claim, right? So science in and of itself can neither prove nor disprove God. It couldn't possibly do that, right? Because again, if God is a metaphysical or meta-scientific claim, then science by definition has nothing to say about it, right? Science must remain silent on that issue. Now, one might certainly say something like, well, it seems most plausible to assume there is a God or there isn't a God, right? Okay, fine, but once again, in terms of the plausibility of that position, you're making a philosophical argument, not a scientific one. Science can neither prove nor disprove non-scientific things. It's as simple as that. To see this point more clearly illustrated and how science is limited in a very basic way, consider a fundamental question, a very basic question. And that question is, how did the universe begin? Right? It's a good question. I'd like to know the answer to that question. It seems that if science can do anything for us, it ought to be able to answer something as simple as that, or at least give us some indication. And of course it can, right? The dominant theoretical model for how the universe began is what's known as the Big Bang theory, right? And this theory holds that, very, very basically, that the universe began with a sort of initial cosmic conflagration, an initial explosion of space-time, matter, so on and so forth. That prior to this, there was nothing, and at some point, right, a singular, particle that contained everything that would become the universe exploded and began expanding outward into the universe in its current form. It's taken 13.8 billion years, but here we are, right? Now, okay, fine. This is a perfectly fine theory, and it does a good job of explaining a lot of cosmological facts that we can see through our telescopes, right? A lot of the nature of the expanding universe, the nature of all sorts of visible and non-visible phenomenon that we can register and record is nicely explained by this theory. But it should be clear that this isn't a complete answer to my question, right? My question was, how did the universe begin? If the answer is, well, at a certain point, something blew up and the universe got started, the obvious question that still remains unanswered is, what preceded that? What came before that? Why was there that initial pinprick of matter? Why were there laws that indicated that it would explode and expand in this way and not another way, right? Why is there, to put it most basically, why is there something instead of nothing, right? Why is there anything in the first place? Why was there that bit of matter? Why are there those laws? Why is there a universe? That question is unanswered, right? Now, the Big Bang doesn't really have to answer that question. This isn't a complaint about it as a theory. As a theory, it's just describing what we've witnessed and positing a likely series of events that led to where we are now. The problem is not with the theory. The problem is with people thinking that science can answer these most basic questions. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, is not a question that science can answer, that physical science can answer. Physical science has to presuppose that there is something, and then it explains it, or it does its best to explain it. But that there is something, why there is something, that's fundamentally mysterious, right? So, suppose we have a cosmologist, though, who's interested in trying to answer this question, right? And there are plenty who are, right? Well, one possible explanation for why did the universe begin, right? Or how did it begin, right? Is that someone might simply say it just did, right? Stephen Hawking argued for such a view, what he called spontaneous creation, right? That the universe just began, right? It just began ex nihilo, out of nothing, and just started, right? For no reason at all. It just began. Okay, well, let's think about that, right? It just did. How does that work as an explanation? To be quite frank, it makes no sense at all, right? Nothing in nature just happens, right? There's a word for events that just happen with no prior cause or necessitating conditions, and that word is miracle, right? For something to just happen is for a miracle to occur, right? At no point in our normal everyday scientific explanations would we be satisfied with that, right? If I see a flower growing in a field and I ask a botanist, why did that flower grow there, right? Or what caused that flower? And they responded, nah, it just happened, just spontaneously came into being. I'd say, get out of here. That's ridiculous, right? It grew from a seed that fell there because it was deposited by the wind, whatever. There's a series of events that led to that flower being there rather than 2 feet to the side, right? Everything, scientifically speaking, has causes, right? It works according to laws. That's what science presupposes. To pretend as though when we get back to the most basic question we could ask, we could simply help ourselves to a miraculous occurrence is to give up doing science in the first place and to appeal to miracles, right? So that's not really a very plausible suggestion. It would be the death of the scientific method to simply say it just happened. Well, maybe we have someone who's a bit cleverer, though, and has another possibility or proposes another possible view here. They say, well, the universe we now occupy arose out of the ashes of a previous universe, right? There was another universe prior to ours, call it universe sub 1, right? And eventually our universe will suffer entropy and heat death, and another universe will eventually arise out of its ashes. Another universe sub 2, whatever, right? Hence, what we would have is something like an infinite series or an infinite cycle of universes rising and falling like the tides, right? So this doesn't run into the initial problem of it just spontaneously starting. It's just been in a cycle of flux. Well, the cycle of universes would thus be defined as an infinite, necessary, and eternal being. Well, fine. But there's another word for such a being, one that has a lot more historical cachet, and that is God, right? If the idea is that science can do away with the need of metaphysical ideas like God, well, this seems as though it runs smack into a metaphysical idea similar to that of God, right? The point that I'm trying to make here is that when we get down to these most basic of questions, we're going to find that all such accounts end up in mystery. Science, no less than religious or theistic accounts of the nature of reality, must appeal to mystery when it comes to these sorts of foundational questions, right? So if the selling point of science was that there's no mystery involved, right? It doesn't take very much to show that that's not the case. When it comes to explaining why there is something rather than nothing, science is every bit as mysterious as religion. So now it becomes a question of assessing costs, right? Which one is more mysterious? Is mystery necessarily a bad thing in explanation, right? Now look, none of this in and of itself is an argument against science. As I've said before, science is the best game in town for what it does. But science, when it begins to think that it can do everything that philosophy and theology do, right, makes a mistake. It gets a little bit too big for its britches and thinks that it's the only game in town when it's not, right? It's a rather new game in town, in fact, and while it's the best there is at what it does, it can't do everything by definition. All right, one more point here on this limited nature of science, right? This is a sort of more general logical point here. What if we were to ask, well, what is the scientific criterion of truth, right? Or what constitutes truth in a scientific sense? How do I know something is true, scientifically speaking? Well, here's a criterion that I've come up with here. Let's call the following criterion S, criterion of science. And it goes like this: X, where X is anything, any claim, X is true if and only if X can be empirically verified, right? Now, empirical means having to do with the senses, right? It can be measured, can be studied, can be sensibly witnessed via observation and experimentation. So this is a pretty decent definition of scientific truth, and I think most scientists would find it more or less sufficient, at least as a basic attempt here. X is true if and only if X can be empirically verified, right? So are ghosts real? Is there such a thing as a ghost? Well, the scientist would probably say, well, I'd have to have empirical verification. If you could measure a ghost and you could, show to my satisfaction that that's what I was witnessing, right? Then sure, then I'll believe in ghosts, but not before, right? I need empirical evidence. I need physical proof, right? So let's think about this criterion. And a question suggests itself right off the bat, and that question is this criterion, is criterion S itself empirically verifiable, right? So recall again that the criteria says X is true if and only if X can be empirically verified. Okay, well, if we're going to be consistent, we would have to empirically verify, right, the truth of this claim. Is criterion S empirically verifiable? Well, it would seem the answer is no, right? Because this is a sort of general metaphysical definition of what truth is. How could I empirically assess the truth or falsity of this general statement? What tests would I run, right? But more importantly, even if it somehow could be empirically verified, that wouldn't matter, right? Because it would be committing the logical fallacy of begging the question. Here's what this means. You cannot utilize a given criterion or definition in order to prove the legitimacy of that same criterion or definition, right? In doing so, you are showing that you are already taking its truth for granted. So if I were to say, okay, X is true if and only if X can be empirically verified, and somehow I can empirically verify that, what I would be doing is presupposing the truth of that criterion in order to justify the truth of that criterion. I would be helping myself to my conclusion, saying that empirical verification is the only thing that matters. So provided I can empirically verify this criterion, it turns out it's true. But that's precisely what's at issue here, is whether or not this criterion is true. Here's another example of begging the question, right? Similar type of fallacy. Person A says, God exists. Person B replies, how do you know? Person A, because it says so in the Bible. Person B, how do you know the Bible is true? Person A, because God wrote it. This is begging the question, right? In order to argue that God exists, they are presupposing the veracity of the Bible as written by God, i.e. they're presupposing God's existence to argue for God's existence. The same thing would be going on here if we attempted to empirically verify the truth of this criterion. We're presupposing the validity of empirical verification in order to prove the validity of empirical verification, right? So the long and the short of it here is that this criterion, which might still be plausible for any number of reasons, is in and of itself not a scientifically verifiable claim. It's a metaphysical claim, i.e. a philosophical claim. There is no avoiding philosophy no matter what you do, right? In order to get started, science has to presuppose a philosophical or metaphysical starting point like this. All right, our final argument for why it's so important to study philosophy is that philosophy is uniquely helpful in answering ethical questions, right? So a very basic question, how can we resolve moral disagreements? Now, if you've spent any time at all on this planet, you've already figured out that moral disagreements are not uncommon. On the contrary, they are very common. They happen daily, right? Sometimes they're relatively small and unimportant. Sometimes they're massive and hugely important. They dictate the fate of nations. They dictate the course of war and peace, right? Moral disagreements are the most important and potentially devastating types of disagreement, right? How do we resolve these? How can we possibly figure out how to resolve it when two people disagree on a question of value? Well, I can see three minimal ways that we could possibly resolve a moral disagreement. The first one is if we could appeal to a common shared culture, religion, or tradition for a solution, right? And oftentimes this is precisely how disputes are solved. If you're a member of a family, right, you could probably just appeal to the familial bonds and traditions and sort of shared heritage that you're all a part of and solve it that way. If you're part of the same religion, you can maybe appeal to a holy book, the words of some religious leader, right, the lessons of tradition, so on and so forth, right? But it should be equally clear that that's not always an option, especially in today's world where we really don't have a common shared culture, religion, or tradition. We have a variety of competing religions, cultures, and traditions. And that's not going to be conducive to this type of solution quite often, right? So this one is fine when you can get it, but oftentimes we can't, right? Now, the second option, and one that's unfortunately all too common, is that people go to war, right? If people can't agree, it turns violent, right? They fight to the death, and whoever wins or whoever's left standing imposes their will unilaterally on those who were defeated, upon the loser, right? The winner dictates terms. Now, this is certainly something that happens and will unfortunately continue to happen, but it's not ideal, obviously, right? We should be able to do better than this when it comes to resolving disputes. So what else can we do? Well, we can reason together, right? We can sit down and discuss it. We can do philosophy and work towards a mutually acceptable, rational solution. Now, does this always work? Obviously not, right? People aren't really all that good at agreeing. People often aren't that good at being rational. People aren't that good at compromise. But what other option do we have, right? We try and work it out through, reasoned conversation, or we're back to option two. So philosophy is really uniquely equipped to help us ask and answer questions like this, right? And science here, it should be clear, is not going to be of any help at all in answering ethical questions. For all of its merits, science won't be able to help us. Science deals in descriptions. Ethics deals with prescriptions or normative claims, right? Science merely describes how things happen. It doesn't tell us what should happen, right? For instance, science can tell me what will happen if I push someone off of the roof of a 10-story building, but it can't tell me that I shouldn't do that, right? Science doesn't deal in prescriptive or normative claims. Science deals with descriptive claims. So science is not going to help us at all when it comes to answering ethical questions. All right, that's the end of this presentation. We've gone through 3 arguments for why it's important to study philosophy and what philosophy is going to be uniquely situated to help us do. Thanks for watching.